Whenever we go through a presidential election that is like the one we have just gone through, where all the warts and wounds of our political process become clear, there's often an opportunity when it's all over to make the process better, to think about how can we reform our election system, how can we reconceptualize the way that we pick presidents. And the good news is that in American history, there have been many moments when we've changed parts of the election process. In the 19th and 20th century, we greatly expanded the number of people who were able to vote. And in the 1970s, quite recently, Democrats changed the way in which we selected the nominee. After the tumultuous convention in Chicago in 1968, Democrats decided that voters would decide who the nominee is through caucuses and primaries, rather than the party bosses who were in the smoke-filled rooms of the party convention. The good news is that overall, the system has worked pretty well. While we have or have had some dictatorial candidates, we have not yet had a dictatorship. And while there are many problems, like the ways in which private money influence politics, citizens still have many opportunities to influence the decision-making as it takes place. But just because a system overall works doesn't mean it can't be made better. So I want to talk about 3 ways in which I think we can reform presidential elections to make our democracy stronger. The first comes down to the power of the dollar. Without any question, the role of private money in elections has become a big problem. We read about it all the time. We hear about how candidates have to spend an enormous amount of time courting donors. Whenever I'm on Capitol Hill or talking to people in the White House, the one thing they all mention instantly is the complaint about how much quote-unquote call time they have to spend trying to raise money. We have seen how super PACs, often funded by individual families or individuals, can finance entire campaigns. We see independent groups, often working in the shadows, running commercials right before elections take place. And my colleague Marty Gillens at Princeton published a really interesting study that found that when it comes to most areas of legislation, elite public opinion usually wins out over the preferences of average citizen, and money is at the heart of the problem. Why has this all happened? There's many reasons. The Supreme Court Citizen United decision broke down some of the regulations that we had on contributions from corporations and union. Businesses since the 1970s have been developing ways to get money to candidates in increasingly sophisticated fashion. And both parties in presidential elections gradually abandoned the post-Watergate reforms that had created a system of public finance for presidential elections. So how can we make things better? Many campaign finance experts, like Mark Schmidt, who's a fellow at New America, have argued that instead of focusing on limiting big donations, we should focus on encouraging small donations. That ultimately in presidential elections, small donations can become a countervailing power to the big donor. And in many parts of the country, there are experiments with how to do this. In Seattle, for example, citizens passed an initiative that raised property taxes, and the money is used to give every resident 4 $25 vouchers. And those vouchers can be donated to candidates in local elections who raise a certain threshold of private donations on their own and who agree to limit their spending. And at the national level, whatever you think of the Bernie Sanders campaign, one of the most remarkable aspects has been how his campaign figured out how to raise massive amounts of small donations that has sustained a national campaign quite successfully, using text techniques and email and social media in ways that have not been done before. So small money is somewhere I think we need to improve our system by bringing more of it in. A second area where we can reconceptualize how we elect presidents has to do with how much time we spend doing this. For people living abroad, it's always remarkable just how long presidential elections go on. Many other countries have shorter elections, whether parliamentary or presidential. Some even have laws that restrict how long this can take. In France, elections take a couple of weeks. In Canada, the longest election in the nation's history was about 10.5 weeks. In Argentina, there's a law that you can't put up ads until about 60 days before an election. And in Japan, elections are also limited just to a handful of days. Here in the United States, elections have become much longer. John Kennedy announced that he was running for president in January of 1960, which today is almost unimaginable. Elections have become longer in part because of the reforms that we put into place. So as caucuses and primaries became important, candidates had to spend more time on the campaign trail. And now we have what is called the invisible primary. Before the caucuses even begin, before the primaries start, candidates have to scramble to start raising money, to start making media appearances, and to start courting political leaders for endorsements. And now we have what some call the media campaign industrial complex, which is churning out politics 24 hours a day and creates pressure very early on for politicians to get their campaign up and running. Why is this a problem? Some people say, look, it's an important job, so we should spend as much time as possible vetting the candidates. But part of the problem is that long process exacerbates the pressure to raise and spend money. So campaign finance and the length of these elections are intricately related. It's also not clear that more time is better time in American politics. Candidates tend to refrain from dealing with very substantive issues. They're always worried about how it will be used against them down the road. So they engage in character attacks and often petty comments about how one or the other candidates look. So giving them more time to do this is not necessarily better for the health of our democracy. And finally, it's not clear that giving voters more time to watch elections helps them focus anymore on the candidates. One of the dynamics you see in elections is people tend to focus in at given moments. The first primary and caucus, Super Tuesday, or something going on in their state. But if you drag this on and create an ongoing, endless process, the risk is people will tune out from the very start. So I think we need to think of reforms, campaign finance reforms involving advertising, thinking of combining primaries as we do in Super Tuesday, internal party reforms that will make this process shorter. And finally, we need to talk about reform with the most basic element of our election process, and that is the vote. During the 1960s, Martin Luther King said that the vote was among the most important goals for civil rights leaders. He once said that if I do not have the vote, I do not possess myself. Meaning that if he didn't have the right to vote, if African Americans didn't have the right to vote, other people essentially made decisions for them. Lyndon Johnson in 1965 made the Voting Rights Act the centerpiece of the Great Society for just this reason. But we've seen since the 1960s that the vote has been threatened in many ways. Some of the threat comes because of the inefficiency of our system. Again, unlike many other countries, we have this bizarre system where we give over 13,000 localities control over Election Day. All the states can make their own rules about how elections should be run. And we count on the individual to do the vote without any kind of penalty, and often put the pressure on the individual to make sure they're ready on Election Day. In Sweden, for example, every voter is automatically registered to vote. So in eliminating these, I think we need to look at what some states have been doing. Same-day registration is a reform that's getting a lot of attention these days. Online registration and e-voting could be very promising as something that could improve the chances we will actually use our democracy. There's also discussion, shouldn't we make Election Day a holiday or move it to the weekend so that people don't have to squeeze voting in between taking their kids to and from school or going to work. But more important than efficiency is making sure that we do not see barriers continue to be placed on the right to vote, which arguably is one of the most devastating developments in recent years. Since the Supreme Court knocked down a key part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we've seen that many states, Texas, Arizona, most recently North Carolina, Wisconsin, are putting laws that actually make it more difficult for individuals who want to vote to do so. North Carolina recently enacted some of the most draconian rules, and the states are getting rid of same-day registration. They're requiring multiple forms of photo ID and other measures that are very restrictive. And this falls hardest on those who need the vote the most, the disadvantaged immigrants, African Americans, and that is the consequence of the laws we have seen, all made on the basis of eliminating voter fraud, which no studies have found is actually a problem in any of these states. So when we talk about reform, working in the states to reverse these changes, and also working in Congress to pass legislation that will reconstitute the Voting Rights Act of 1965, should be front and center. There are other reforms people like to talk about. Getting rid of the Electoral College is a favorite, but that's one that doesn't have a lot of traction usually. Even after the 2000 election, there wasn't a lot of support. But the good news is there are politically viable reforms that are on the table. I spend my whole career teaching students about politics, writing books about our politics, and studying politics, and writing in newspapers and online and in magazine about politics. And I have never felt in my time that there is a more urgent need to think about how we can reform our election process, how to make it more accountable, how to make it more equitable, how to make it more efficient, how to make sure it is as democratic as can be. Unless we make these kinds of changes, unless we take those kinds of opportunities, we will never fulfill the democratic promise that this country holds.